Welcome. We are so excited to have our guest with us here today and thankful that he has taken his time to support us, and particularly those of us obviously in Ontario, because today we're going to be talking about TRESA. And obviously those of you who are part of our coaching community, I mean, we've always worked really hard to be advocates for, fiduciary duties, representation, and that side of things with buyer presentations and consultations. So we've continued to up our game there. But there's so many questions about these major changes. So today we are so grateful to welcome Ray Ferris. And Ray is OREA, Ontario Real Estate Association's Realtor in Residence. He is also the TRESA expert, and he is here to help us all understand TRESA changes, how they can revolutionize your business, and I'm sure our industry, and explore the topics like self-represented parties, the new RECO Information Guide, and rules overall for sharing the contents of competing offers, as we know that has changed, and the concept of designated representation. Now, we've worked with clients in, West Coast and clients across North America who have worked with designated representation for years now. So there's definitely some of our Canadian colleagues who have a lot of insight into that side of it. I'm personally excited for that change. I think it'll be fantastic. And our colleagues using it, every single one I've talked to has concurred. They enjoy designated representation. And Ray is also going to help us gain a competitive edge and ensure that we're in compliance in this transformational or transformative era in Ontario for real estate. So Ray, thanks so much for being here. I know you're doing a lot of advocacy and support for the industry. We really appreciate your time. And I just want to make sure, as you're sharing so much insight, that everybody knows you can put questions in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom, and I will moderate that. And at the end, Ray, I think you said you have some time for questions. So we'll dive into that as much as we can. So welcome, and thanks so much for being here, Ray.
Yeah, well, thank you guys very much for inviting me. It's my privilege to be amongst the cream of the crop realtors in our industry. And I know you guys are, by the fact that you're investing in your own realtor success. So I love speaking to like-minded realtors. And as Kathleen mentioned, that is what I am. I'm a realtor. I've been a realtor for 28 years. I own my own small boutique brokerage on the North Shore of Lake Erie. So if you're wondering what in the world does a practicing realtor happen to know about Ontario's new real estate legislation, let me share with you how I've come to learn this information that I'm going to share with you today. So the Ontario Real Estate Association lobbied the provincial government for years to modernize the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act. Our former act, REBA, was 21 years old. It needed improvements. So after years of lobbying, the provincial government decided to, in fact, cause changes to the act. And to facilitate that conversation with the government, after the government, in fact, reached out to its stakeholders, OREA struck a task force to facilitate that conversation, and I was appointed chair of that task force. I've been chair of the task force since day one. That's been 3 or 4 years now. And I mention this for one reason, and one reason only. OREA has had a front row seat at the table from day one with both the government of Ontario and with the Real Estate Council of Ontario. So the information that I share with you guys today is firsthand information, and that's important. The reason that that is so critical is because I see a lot of things said on social media that aren't correct about TRESA. You've came to the right source to make sure that you are in fact in compliance. In my capacity as OREA's Realtor in Residence, I get all kinds of questions, hundreds of questions every day that I respond to, and there's a lot of confusion out there. So you're going to have the right information at the conclusion of our time together this morning. And I'm going to fast forward through a lot of this stuff. I'm going to focus on those key changes that you need to know. So let's dive right in to the really important stuff that we need to review together this morning. And right out of the gate, I need to let you know that I am a realtor. I'm not a lawyer, so none of this stuff should be considered legal advice. But more importantly than that, is that I'm going to use a lot of real estate examples. I'm not going to sit here and read from a textbook. And I use those real estate examples to show you how these new regulations will work in practice. And sometimes, just quite possibly, some of the examples that I use are different than your brokerage policies would allow. And if that in fact is the case, well, obviously you have to adhere to your brokerage policies. So this stuff rolled out on December 1, as you know. We've been practicing this for 2 or 3 days already, and some of the realtors in my brokerage are coming to me with questions and letting me know how this stuff is working out in practice. What I want to emphasize, however, is this website at the bottom of your screen. It is your one-stop shop for all things TRESA beyond today. You're going to have questions tonight, tomorrow, next week, next year. That website that I just introduced is your one-stop shop to answer those questions. I'll talk about that at the conclusion. So phase 1 has been in effect for 2 or 3 years already, 3 years actually, as of October of 2020. I'm not going to review that. I want to focus on some of the key changes to your business practice. So here are those 8 key changes that came into effect Friday. Here's what I'm going to zero in on during our time together. The elimination of customers from real estate legislation. They ceased to exist on Friday. And then let's talk about the information guide. That's topic number 4. I'm going to let you know how to use it and what your obligations are with regards to that information guide. And then the big one, the most controversial, but my favorite part of this morning's presentation is the sharing of contents of competing offers. And then we're going to focus in on designated rep. So let's first dive right in to the elimination of customer. I'm sure all of you on this call are well aware that customer has been removed from real estate legislation. And the reason for that was a very good one. When we were consulting with the government of Ontario, they told us that real estate consumers were oftentimes confused about the differences between customers and clients within REBA. And I'm sure all of you guys would agree. It was confusing to our consumers, wasn't it? The government doesn't like confusion for consumers. They want to make real estate relationships crystal clear. They want to eliminate any gray. They wanted to make this black and white. So here's how they did that. As you guys know, as I mentioned, customer ceases to exist. It's gone. Clients, on the other hand, continue to exist. The duties and obligations we owe clients today are the same duties and obligations that we owed our clients under REBA. However, with customer being removed from legislation, there's this new animal that's introduced right into TRESA. And that new animal is called self-represented party. So by way of summary, customers no longer exist. You're either a client of the brokerage or you're on your own. That is to say, you're a self-represented party. And let me be clear, self-represented party is not a new sexier name for customer. They are very different. SRP is not a name change for customers. So let's have a look at that. The definition of a self-represented party right from legislation is a very easy one. A self-represented party is simply a party who is not a client of any brokerage. That's easy. But remember when I said SRP is not a new name for customers, that SRP is an entirely different new animal? Let me introduce to you one of those significant differences. So in REBA, remember how the brokerage could sign written agreements with clients and customers? We could enter into written agreements with customers, couldn't we? However, TRESA says that the brokerage cannot enter into written agreements with anyone other than a customer, or excuse me, other than a client. That is to say, the brokerage cannot enter into written agreements with self-represented parties. So you may say, well, Ray, what does that mean for me as a realtor? Why does that matter? Well, let me introduce to you a real life example of how different this is for us. So let's say I'm working with a buyer client, and the buyer client that I'm working with expresses interest in a for sale by owner. So previously in REBA, I would approach that for sale by owner and I would say, will you let me show your property to a buyer that I'm working with? And if I sell it, will you pay me? And oftentimes those FSBOs say yes, don't they? Those FSBOs will say, yes, if you can net me what I want in my pocket, I'll let you show my property and I'll pay you for your services. And how did we get paid from FSBOs who aren't clients, are they? They truly, a FSBO is truly the definition of a self-represented party, aren't they? How did we get paid in REBA? Well, we had that FSBO, that self-represented party, sign an agreement, didn't we? We had them sign, most commonly, OREA's customer service agreement for a property not listed for sale. And that's how we were assured that we were getting paid. But remember what I just said a couple of minutes ago? Brokerages can no longer enter into written agreements with anyone other than a client. That means we cannot ask a self-represented party, in my example, a FSBO, to sign anything, even if it's just to get paid. We can only sign written agreements with clients. Why, oh why, you ask? Why, Ray, did the government do this? The answer is simple. Remember when I said out of the gate, the government wants to eliminate that confusion that previously existed within REBA about the differences between being a customer and being a client? They're taking a very principled approach here to the fact that you're either a client or you're not. And if you're not, you're a self-represented party. And the government believes that by allowing anyone other than a client to sign any type of an agreement, it may leave them with the perception that they in fact are receiving services, that they in fact are a client. So to make sure that that perception doesn't exist, to make sure that it's crystal clear to consumers as to whether or not they're a client, anybody who is not a client cannot enter into a written agreement with the brokerage. That's a huge change, isn't it, for us? Because we could previously get paid by customers, whereas we cannot get paid any longer directly from SRPs. So I know you probably want to know, how in the world would you get paid in an example like the one that you just raised, Ray? Well, we all know as professional realtors that we can get paid directly from the buyer, pursuant to the terms of a buyer representation agreement. We can ask the buyers to pay us, can't we? But guys, I've been a realtor for 28 years, as I mentioned. I'm still a practicing realtor. I'm in the trenches with you each and every day. I know that it's not always possible. I know it's not reasonable to always rely upon a BRA to get paid from a buyer. Like there's first-time home buyers who only have 5% skin in the game to be able to put down the minimum down payment to buy their first home. They don't have thousands of extra dollars left over to be able to pay us, do they? So relying upon the BRA isn't always going to work. OREA has another recommendation for you to get paid other than the BRA. That is, you can ask the self-represented party, the FSBO in my example, to retain your services for the provision of one simple service. And that simple service to that FSBO, using my example, stick with my example, is the presentation of an offer. That's it. That's the only service that you're going to provide to that SRP, that FSBO. I like to call that a mini listing agreement. OREA calls it a limited services agreement. So in my example, you can ask the FSBO, who agrees to pay you if you simply bring them an offer, to sign that mini listing agreement, that limited services agreement. And that is your way to be assured that you're going to get paid. But do you guys see what happened there? When that FSBO, that self-represented party, signed an agreement, they became a client, didn't they? Because remember, the brokerage can't enter into any agreement with anyone other than a client. So when that FSBO, that self-represented party, in fact signs that agreement, that mini listing agreement, that limited services agreement, whatever you want to call it, they in fact became a client, didn't they? And because that FSBO, that seller, signed an agreement, and you have a buyer client, what else do you have? You now have multiple representation, don't you? You have two clients in connection with the same trade. That's multiple rep. Remember off the top, guys, I said I hear a lot of things said on social media about TRESA that aren't true. One of those things that I hear is that multiple representation has been banned within TRESA, and that's not true. Multiple representation is alive and well. The way we practice multiple representation today under TRESA rules is exactly the same way we practiced it under REBA, with a couple of minor differences that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But we can do this, guys, can't we? We can ask self-represented parties to sign agreements, even for limited services, in order to make that transaction work, can't we? So on that note, I know you're probably wondering, well, Ray, what can we really do with an SRP? And the legislation answers that. TRESA defines what we can do to interact with an SRP. Let's take a look at that definition or that guiding principle within TRESA. This is the third bullet point on your screens. This needs to be your golden nugget that you take away from this conversation. And I'm going to repeat this golden nugget several times in the next few minutes to the point that you're probably going to get annoyed. But it's critically important that we understand this two-step process right in TRESA. So let's take a look at it. Remember, it's two parts. Let's look at the first part. The first part says, any help that you give to an SRP must be an actual service to the client of the brokerage. And before we take a deep dive on that, guys, do you notice how I keep saying help or assistance? I'm deliberately using the word help because we're not allowed to provide services. We're not allowed to provide opinions or advice to self-represented parties because they truly are on their own. Remember, they're not a client of the brokerage. So always remember, you can help an SRP, but only if that help is a service to a client of the brokerage. So what does that really mean? Let's say there's a buyer out there in the marketplace who, for whatever wild and crazy reason, does not want to become a client. They truly want to be self-represented. Yet they want to look at a property that my brokerage has listed for sale. So my question is, can I show that self-represented buyer my brokerage's listing, my seller client's property that I have listed for sale? Well, of course I can. Showing the self-represented buyer, showing any buyer my seller client's property is in fact a service to my client, isn't it? So that's really what that first part of this two-step process means. Any help must be as a service to an actual client of the brokerage. The next part of this two-step process, guys, is going to get a little bit gray, but I promise I'll bring it home for you in the coming slides. The second part says that any help that you give to a self-represented party must not use your skill or your judgment. Well, what's your skill and judgment? Those are your opinions, that's your advice, and those are services. So let me use an example to illustrate what that really means. Let's think of that same buyer who chooses to be self-represented for whatever reason. And then they look at my brokerage's listing, the property that we have available for sale for our seller client. And then that same SRP buyer says, Ray, I love it. I want to buy it. I want to put in an offer. But before I do that, I need you to prepare a CMA for me because I don't understand market value here in this town. I'm new to this town. Help me understand the value of this home by preparing a CMA for me. So my question to you is, after reviewing this two-step process within TRESA, is can you prepare that CMA for this self-represented buyer? And to answer that, or any question about an SRP, we've got to think about that two-step process. So let's go through it again. The first part says any help you give to an SRP must be because it's a service to an actual client. Well, I think we're okay so far, right? Preparing a CMA for a self-represented buyer in an effort to get an offer on the table for my seller is a service to my seller client, isn't it? Let's look at the second part. That says any help that I give to an SRP must not use my skill or my judgment. Let me ask you this in order to answer, can we prepare that CMA for that buyer? is looking for sold listings on the MLS, is selecting properties that have sold that are truly comparable to the subject property using our skill or our judgment? It does, doesn't it? So therefore, the answer is no. In that example, I cannot prepare a CMA for that self-represented buyer because selecting those listings, those sold listings, require my skill and judgment. And if that's gray, don't worry. We're going to bring this home in a few minutes on other slides. At this point, this is a very important part, is there's a couple of things that you are required to do before you provide an SRP with any help. You're required to give them a couple of new forms or a couple of new documents. The first is called the information guide. That's one of the topics we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And we're going to pause a further discussion on the information guide until that time, because the information guide isn't just for self-represented parties. It's for all real estate consumers. What is unique, however, to a self-represented party is the next form, the next mandatory form required from TRESA. It's right in the legislation that we must present all self-represented buyers with a copy of a form that's called the Information and Disclosure to Self-Represented Parties. Now, both the information guide and the information and disclosure form must be authored by RECO. OREA, who creates all those wonderful forms we use in our day-to-day business, the listing agreements, BRAs, etc., will not be creating either the info guide or the information and disclosure form. Why? Because TRESA says right in the law that RECO must be the author, and we must use the RECO versions. You can't create your own. So by way of summary, before you give any help to an SRP, you've got to give them the info guide, and you've got to present them with this information and disclosure form. Let's take a look at the information and disclosure form. And there's several things that the legislation requires be included on this form. RECO released this form for all of us to see a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure you guys have all taken a look at it. It's right on the RECO website at reco.on.ca. It's just a 2-page document. And the second page is really just a signature section. The first page just explains to anyone who's thinking about being self-represented that the real estate brokerage, in fact, has a client in connection with this transaction. And oh, by the way, that's not you. That's not you. You're not our client because you decided to go it alone. You said you wanted to be self-represented. You indicated you did not want to be a client. However, the other party in connection with this transaction is our client. Then this form goes on to explain to the self-represented party that their decision to go it alone carries with it significant risks, and that the self-represented party needs to be able to stomach those risks. And then the form explains to the self-represented party the type of help that we're able to give them. And it doesn't say on this form the types of activities in which we can help them. It's not going to say to a self-represented buyer, we can show you properties that our brokerage has listed for sale. We can give you a generic list of local lenders. It's not detailed in any way. You guys already know what this is because we talked about it on our prior slide. It says to self-represented parties, the only reason that the brokerage is even helping you is because the help they're giving you is in fact a service to their real client. And oh, by the way, any help that the brokerage gives to you is not going to use their skill or judgment. And then the form recommends to the individual who chooses to be self-represented that they in fact get independent professional advice. Now, I know we all automatically think that means legal advice, but it means more than that. A recommendation to get independent professional advice might also mean you should consider becoming a client of another real estate brokerage because the decision to buy and sell real estate is such a significant one. You should, in fact, be represented. Is this form not a good thing? Is this not a good thing that we're educating consumers about their options to be represented or not? And if they choose to be self-represented, they're made aware of what a risky decision that is. As professional realtors, we certainly want to work with fully informed consumers, don't we? We want increased clarity in our real estate transactions. And I think this form makes it black and white as to what it means, what the ramifications are of not being a client. So as I mentioned, this form is available on reco.on.ca. So as we wrap up a discussion of self-represented party, I just want to go through 3 questions, and these are really designed to make sure you fully understand the differences between the old customers and the new self-represented party. So the first one is this: can I show a buyer who chooses to be self-represented a property that's listed for sale with another real estate brokerage? And to answer that, what do? We go back to that 2-step process right in TRESA. The first part says any help that you give to an SRP must be as a service to a client of your brokerage. Well, we've got our answer already, don't we? Another brokerage's listing is not your seller client. Therefore, the answer is no. You cannot show another brokerage's listing to a self-represented buyer. The next one is this. Let's say that same buyer who selected to be self-represented and who I showed my seller client's property to says to me, "Ray, I love it. I want to buy it. Let's go back to your office right now and let's write up an offer. I want you to help me write an offer." So my question to you is this: as a service to my seller client, to make sure that any offer submitted is airtight and bulletproof, do I write that offer up for the self-represented buyer? And to answer that question, we've got to go back to that 2-step process again. I warned you guys we were going to talk about that a lot. So the first part of that 2-step process is any help you give to a self-represented party must be a service to a client of the brokerage. Well, I think we'd be okay, wouldn't we, writing up an offer so far for a self-represented buyer, because getting an offer on the table for our actual client, the seller in this example, is in fact a service to our seller client, isn't it? But then we've got to look at the second part, which says any help must not use your skill or judgment. Is selecting conditions, is selecting clauses to make sure that they're worded correctly and technically correct. Is recommending conditions and clauses requiring our skill or our judgment? It is, isn't it? So therefore, the answer is no. You cannot write up an offer, as per my example, for a self-represented buyer. Let's go to number 3. Let's say I just listed a brand new property for sale today, and I plant the for sale sign in the front yard, and a buyer drives by and sees my for sale sign and phones me about my new listing. And she says to me, "How much is your new listing?" And when I tell her, she says, "Oh, I can't afford it. It's $200,000 more than my budget will allow. I'm not approved for that much money." Yet I know, as a practicing realtor in that neighborhood, that there's 2 other properties currently available for sale that are lesser priced, that are in fact within this buyer's budget. But guess what? They're listed for sale with another real estate brokerage. And remember, this was a cold call. I don't know this buyer, so this buyer is therefore not my client, is she? And remember, I can't show another brokerage's listing to anyone other than a client. So do I just simply not make this cold call buyer aware of those other properties available for sale with another brokerage that are in fact within her budget? because she's not my client. Well, that's not the expectation of TRESA. The expectation is that our former customers, who we could have showed another brokerage's listing to, become clients. We are expected to treat buyers who want to look at another brokerage's listings as clients. Now, I know some of you right now might be saying, but Ray, I hate the hard sell. Ray, I hate to ask buyers to sign a buyer representation agreement to become my client before I build relationships with them. Ray, I instead prefer to take a buyer out on a couple of appointments and show them how much I truly have their best interest at heart. I instead prefer to build relationships with buyers before I ask them to sign a contract. Right? A lot of us do that, don't we? We instead prefer to build relationships with buyers before we ask them to sign that BRA. The reason I mention this is to let you know, to remind you that agency relationships can be created in other ways other than in writing. That is to say, you can create client relationships with buyers other than having them sign a BRA. We do it all the time. When buyers ask us questions and we answer their questions and give them our opinion or our advice, we've treated them like a client. And in fact, we then have a client on our hands. What do we know that as? The legislation refers to that as implied agency. Implied agency is the creation of client relationships by the things we say and the things we do, not just in writing. Remember learning about implied agency during your real estate registration courses? So here's how I recommend we do this moving forward. So when that cold lead says, Ray, your listing isn't of interest to me, it's outside of my budget, yet I know there's other properties available for sale that are in fact within her budget, here's what I'm going to say to her on the phone. There's a couple of other properties currently available for sale in the same neighborhood that you're looking in that are in fact lesser priced. They're in your budget. Can I tell you about them? And what's a sincere, bona fide buyer going to say? Yeah, sure. Tell me about them. And then I'm going to say to that cold lead right on the phone, would you like me to provide you with a list of properties that have sold in the neighborhood within the last 90 days? This service is designed to help you better understand what current market value is. And as realtors, we know buyers crave sold data, don't they? So what's the buyer going to say to my offer to provide her with sold listing information? She's going to say yes, isn't she? And then the third thing I'm going to ask is this. When I find you a property that you fall in love with and you want to buy, are you able to write your own real estate contracts? And what's a buyer going to say to that? No, I don't know how to do that. That's what I need you for. The reason that I asked those three questions was because I got the buyer to respond to receive services from me. And now I have a client on my hands. I created a client by implied agency or implied representation, and I have yet to get a BRA signed. Do you guys do that all the time today? You do, don't you? And you've created client relationships by implied agency when you do that. But I'm going to take it a step further than just that conversation. I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to email that buyer. Here's what the email is going to look like. As per your request, here are the feature sheets of those properties that we discussed on the telephone. Would you be available to take a look at them tomorrow afternoon? And then the next paragraph is going to say, as per your request, as a service to you, here are a summary of properties that have sold in the neighborhood within the last 90 days. This service is designed to help you truly understand how the market is behaving, what market value truly is, something to that effect. And then the third thing, that I'm going to say in that email is here's a link to some information about real estate that we'll discuss when we meet for the very first time. That link is a tease to help you comply with another part of TRESA that we're going to discuss next. So my whole point in this conversation was you can create agency other than in writing by the things you say and you do. Now, let me be clear. If you get a BRA signed before you take a buyer out and show them properties, that's the gold standard. That's textbook best practice. Don't change what you're doing. That's fantastic work. But if you instead choose to build relationships before you ask a buyer to sign a BRA, you want them to grow to trust you, that's okay too. You can still show them another brokerage's listings when you create that implied representation by way of creating relationships. Now, TRESA still does say that a BRA is required at the earliest practical opportunity and always before signing an offer. So this doesn't negate implied agency, doesn't remove the obligation to, in fact, commit that relationship to writing. You still need to do that. So I mention all of this so that you don't leave this presentation feeling like you can't show another brokerage's listings to anyone other than a client, which is true. But as professionals, we're going to build those relationships and create client relationships. So let's summarize. Customers are gone from TRESA. Within TRESA, you're either a client of the brokerage or you're a nobody. And if you choose to be self-represented, I can help you, but only because that help is an actual service to my actual client. And oh, by the way, any help that I give to you will not use my skill or my judgment. So I'm sure you guys now appreciate self-represented party is a lot more than a simple name change, isn't it? And lastly, remember, the brokerage is no longer permitted to enter into written agreements with anyone other than a client. That is to say, the brokerage cannot enter into written agreements with self-represented parties, meaning we cannot get paid directly from a self-represented party, only a client. And as Kathleen said off the top, I'm happy to take questions at the conclusion and our remaining time together about SRPs. I know it's a significant shift. Let's now talk about the information guide. As you guys, I'm sure, are all aware, the information guide is a new document that we're provided to give to every single real estate consumer. We've got to give this to prospective clients before we provide them with any services. And in the case of an SRP, as we already discussed, you've got to give them this information guide before you provide them with any help. That's the first part of your obligations. There's only two obligations you have under TRESA with this info guide. The first part, as I mentioned, is you give everybody a copy. The second part says you review it with them. Those are your only two obligations. Provide them with a copy and review it with them. That's it. That I say that TRESA requires how you provide this information guide to consumers. I didn't, did I? That's totally up to you. If you want to send consumers a copy of the information guide by way of email, like you attach a PDF, that's cool. If you want to print this thing off and give them a hard copy, that's okay too. Remember when I sent that email to the buyer when I was creating implied agency and I said, here's a link to some information about real estate that we're going to discuss when we meet for the very first time? Guess what that link was? That link was, in fact, a link to the information guide. See how quickly and easily I gave the consumer the information guide at the earliest practical opportunity? So you've got to choose the format in which you want to deliver the information guide. The regulations don't say how you do that. Did I say that the regulations require you get an acknowledgement from the consumer that you gave them the guide and you reviewed it with them? I didn't say that, did I? There's no obligation that you get an acknowledgement from consumers that you gave them the guide and reviewed it with them. Now, having said that, you guys are cream of the crop realtors, I know, because you're with Kathleen Black. I'm sure you all agree it would be a very good best practice to get an acknowledgement from consumers that you gave them this guide. We don't want to get in a he said, she said situation where a seller says, Ray never gave me a copy of the guide. So it's probably a best practice to get an acknowledgement. As a matter of fact, RECO, who, as I mentioned, is the author of the guide, they did put a signature section on the last page of the guide. So RECO has provided us with a tool to get that acknowledgement. If you want to create your own in-house acknowledgement form where you have consumers sign that you gave them the guide, that's cool too. It's totally up to you. If you go above and beyond those 2 regulations within TRESA, that is, give everybody a copy of the guide and review it with them, that's outstanding. All right. Now, the information guide, I'm sure you guys have all looked at it, is 12 pages long. It's huge, isn't it? There's a lot of info in that info guide. Let me summarize what's in there. And this is what TRESA, this is what the regulations within the legislation says needs to be in the guide. First, it explains real estate relationships. It says, if you become a client of the brokerage, here's all the benefits of doing so. Here's all the benefits of becoming a client of a brokerage. And then it goes on to say, here's all the duties and obligations that the brokerage owes to you. And then it says this is a two-way street. When you become a client of the brokerage, you have obligations to the brokerage. Sellers who sign a listing agreement have an obligation to pay us, don't they? Buyers who sign a BRA have an obligation to refer inquiries to us, don't they? And then it goes on to say, here's all the risks that you have to be able to stomach if you choose to be self-represented. So there's a very detailed discussion of real estate relationships for increased clarity. And then there's a big focus of what consumers should be looking for in the info guide when they sign a written agreement with a brokerage. What's a written agreement with a brokerage? The BRA and the listing agreement. So it says to consumers, here's what you should be paying specific attention to in those written agreements. You're responsible for knowing what you're signing. Make sure you know the expiry date. Make sure you know the remuneration. And in the interest of time, guys, I'm not going to do a huge deep dive any further into the info guide because I assume you've got a little bit of background knowledge of what's in here and you've already read it. I really want to take some time to answer your questions in our remaining time. Again, it's available at reco.on.ca. You've got to get a good grasp of it because the expectation is that you explain it to consumers. Here's a fun one, my favorite part of today's presentation. As you guys know, within REBA, we had an obligation to tell all buyers the number of offers they were competing against in a bidding war, right? If there were 10 offers for the seller's consideration, we had to tell all 10 buyers that there's 10 offers for the seller's consideration. That obligation remains within TRESA. You still have to tell all buyers the number of offers they're competing against. However, within TRESA, the barrier to share the contents of competing offers has been removed. That is to say, the seller can now instruct you as a listing agent to tell everybody the terms of a buyer's offer if they in fact submitted a competing written offer. That's something we couldn't do in REBA, right? But here's what you need to know. The sellers don't have to pick a lane. There's no rules within TRESA that says a seller has to tell you before you submit an offer and you find yourself in a bidding war, whether or not they're going to share the terms of your offer. A seller can make that decision whenever they want. They don't have to tell you in advance if they're going to share or not. So as of Friday, we needed to start explaining to buyers this new option for sellers. And it's just an option. If they want to continue a blind bidding process the way they used to be required to do so, they can. But if they want to share the contents of competing offers, that's up to them. So the first thing we need to do is educate our buyers about this new option. They're not going to know about it. And then more importantly than that, I think we need to say to our buyer clients is, look, if the seller shared the terms of your offer with another buyer, how would that make you feel? Like literally, we need to ask them that. How would you feel if this happened to you? And if you have a buyer who is opposed to that process, they don't like it, OREA has recommended one new clause this year. The new clause basically puts pressure on the seller not to share the terms of that buyer's offer if that clause is inserted in the APS. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive on that clause at this point. The expectation is you've already reviewed the OREA updated forms, the new forms, the revised forms, and witnessed that new clause so that we can save a lot of time for questions. Let's talk about designated rep before we jump into that Q&A. Designated representation is something that OREA has lobbied for as far back as 2017. So what is it? It allows a real estate brokerage, when the brokerage has more than one client in connection with the same trade, to designate a different agent to fully represent each of the respective clients without the limitations of multiple rep. So remember in REBA that if you and I worked in the same real estate brokerage and I listed a property for sale on behalf of the brokerage and you were working with a buyer who submitted an offer, that meant the buyer and seller who was in multiple representation received limited services. Like this is multiple rep 101, right? In multiple rep, the clients involved in multiple rep receive limited services. Designated representation changes that. Thinking back to my example, I list a property for sale on behalf of the brokerage. You and I work together at the same brokerage. You're working with a buyer client on behalf of the brokerage, and our brokerage practices designated representation. I, in fact, can be the designated rep for the seller and the only representative for the seller. Unlike in REBA, where you were also deemed to be a representative of the seller by the mere fact that we worked at the same brokerage. Which was crazy, wasn't it? My seller never met you. My seller didn't know you, but you were deemed to be a representative of the seller too by the mere fact that we worked together in the same brokerage. And likewise, same thing with BRAs. When you signed a BRA with your buyer, everybody in the brokerage was also deemed to be a representative of that buyer. But that's no longer the case with designated rep. On your screens, you can see the updated listing agreement from OREA. I've highlighted in yellow how a seller would appoint me as their designated rep. They just simply put my name on that line. They put Ray Ferris on that line, and right then and there, I'm their representative. I'm their only representative. And when you sign a BRA with a buyer and the buyer fills your name in on the designated representation line on the BRA, you're the buyer's representative and the only buyer's representative. The rest of us who work in the brokerage with you, we are not agents for your buyer. You are not agents for my seller. And in that case, when you bring an offer on my listing, even though we work for the same brokerage, that is not multiple representation any longer because the brokerage is no longer responsible for the representation. The brokerage remains responsible for the services of the agreement, but I'm responsible for the representation of the seller. You are responsible for the representation of the buyer. Now, guys, I could go on in great detail about this and some of the other topics, but I did an aggressive, very quick session because I know you guys are fully engaged with a lot of these changes already. And I did it quickly so that I can turn things over to Kathleen to ask me your questions where you've still got some gray area.
Thank you so much, Ray. I just want to let you know there's been some phenomenal feedback on the simplicity of this and the straightforwardness to be able to implement in our businesses. So thank you so much to you for that. Welcome. And we do definitely have a list of questions, and it's interesting because I'm going to leave them all to you, Ray. You're here as the expert. I think some of them will also lead into, you know, the way that we service clients and our systems and things like that. So let's go through because we have a few of them. Yeah, so ahead. We will go in order of question received, just so everyone knows. So first, Mustak, good to see you from Century 21 Leading Edge. We're happy you are here. He has the question, when at a listing presentation, can we discuss the CMA, comparative market analysis, to come to a price of the property? As I understand, we cannot share any comparable until we have them signed as a client, as in a listing agreement. When can we discuss the actual price and or comparables? Yeah, great question. I get that one all the time. And there was one
thing that you said in that question that wasn't correct. You are not required to have that client sign any type of an agreement so that you can share information with them about sold data. So there's two ways we can approach this. So let me first address it from the desk of the regulator. That is the Real Estate Council of Ontario. RECO has said that providing a CMA to a prospective seller is not considered a trade in real estate, and therefore you don't have to worry whether or not they're a client or an SRP. You don't have to worry about giving your skill and judgment, your opinions and advice is creating a client relationship, because RECO doesn't recognize it as that. From my standpoint, I take a little bit of a different view, and this has been confirmed by OREA's legal counsel, who I speak to on a daily basis. Look, if we create implied agency with a seller by simply giving them a CMA, what harm is there in that, right? Like, let's say a prospective seller interviews 3 different realtors. We all know, as practicing realtors, that the expectation of that prospective seller is that we're going to give them our opinions and our advice with regards to what they should list their home for sale. Like, that's their expectation, isn't it? And so if we do give them a CMA and we create implied agency, there's no harm in that whatsoever, because implied agency is alive and well. So my point is, RECO's got one interpretation, which wouldn't get you in hot water by providing that CMA. OREA has a different point of view from a different legal perspective, which won't get you in hot water either. So continue doing what you're doing when it comes to CMAs. We don't need to worry about that one.
And Ray, just to make sure for everyone listening, because you've done a great job keeping it simple. So I'm agent number 1, right? Let's say, and there's 3 competing agents. Personally, I like to go in last, but we'll leave that to the side. So I'm in number 1. I go through, I've created implied agency. The second realtor comes in. They, for argument's sake, have created implied agency. The third comes in, they sign with the third. The third is now the official fiduciary duty or agent, and the other are not in effect in any way. Is that correct? Or can you just clarify?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. You know, when we think of creating implied agency with buyers, what's the risk of not getting a written representation agreement, a BRA, from a buyer when you're taking them out and showing them property? That buyer does something dumb and goes back home and uses a realtor from elsewhere to create their APS. Right? We're just not getting paid, right? But there's no legal jeopardy there in any way whatsoever. So the lesson is, keep doing what you're doing, keep continuing to provide that CMA as a service to your prospective clients.
Absolutely. And on the other side of it, maybe the buyer didn't do anything dumb. Maybe the agent wasn't prepared and the next agent was. I'll put it out there, because, you know, many a time a buyer consultation is a powerful thing. So thank you for that first question. Chris Owens, welcome. Thank you for the question. He is asking, in your example of FSBO and mini listing limited services, when will the FSBO acknowledge and sign the RECO guide?
Yeah, that always should be done at the earliest practical opportunity, which, according to TRESA, is before providing any services to a client or a prospective client for that matter. And in the case of an SRP, before you provide any help. The answer, Chris, is you've got to present it to them as soon as it's practically possible. And obviously, we keep in mind when it's going to be comfortable for our consumer as well, right? There's this perception out there that I keep hearing that if we're hosting an open house and a buyer walks through the door, we can't even smile at that buyer until we slap them with the information guide. That's just not reasonable or realistic, guys. You've got to adopt a practice that works in the marketplace, that's comfortable to you. The answer to the question is, you present that information guide when it's the right time to do so. Treat it just like you do the working with a realtor document. Definitely before any services to a client, definitely before any help to an SRP. But the perception that you have to pull the information guide out of thin air when somebody asks you how's the market, that's not necessary.
Okay, thank you, Ray and Chris. So it sounds like the more we have a systematic approach that gives us that line in the sand, right? When to talk about the fiduciary agency
Yeah, and think
option.
back to my example, Chris, when I sent that email to that prospective buyer where I was trying to create implied agency, I sent them a link right then and there. I got it out of the way at the earliest practical opportunity, and I think I did it in a non-threatening way.
Okay, excellent. And this came up as anonymous attendee. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but thank you for the question. How does the new regulation affect marketing efforts? For example, in the past, if we spoke to someone by means of a cold call and they showed interest in wanting to buy, just not right now, right away, and they don't want to become a client at the time, but would like us to send them listings, can or should we still be sharing listings that are not from our personal brokerage? As in this case, this individual would not be a client or customer yet.
Yeah, so the answer is continue doing what you're doing. The information that you're providing to them, that is new listings, is simply information. You're not giving advice. You're not giving opinions. You're just simply setting them up on a drip campaign so that they receive real-time notice of new listings as they become available. Now, if that buyer who's receiving those listings by way of a drip campaign calls you about a particular listing and you cross that line, that fine line in the sand from providing them just information to answering questions that gives opinions or advice, then you're creating client relationships at that point. But if you're simply just meeting people at open houses, they agree to receive additional listings from you by way of drip campaign, they provide you with their email address, keep doing it, guys. That's just information. Just remember, really the line in the sand, the trigger is when you start using opinions or advice that you really need to think about. Is this person a client or are they going to be an SRP?
Yeah. And Ray, you tell me if this is helpful or not. I mean, I know in our community, and a lot of people attending are in our coaching community, we really liken it to other professional status, right? Lawyer, doctor, accountant, there's a really clear line. It's like I can meet a lawyer at a, conference, or they're a legal practice that's, exhibiting, and I can talk to them in general about what they do. But when it comes down to the nitty gritty, if they're going to give me advice, I'm going to have a meeting, they're going to go over things, I'm going to sign a retainer. It's very clear. So it's not the exact same, but I think when we think about it in those professions, it's a lot more clear cut for us to see those examples. I don't know if you like that similarity or
You know
not.
what? That's a beautiful analogy. I'm going to use it moving forward. I wish I thought of it myself.
Yeah, it's helpful. I mean, I think as realtors, if we provide services after we've secured, our relationship, everybody's just better off, in my opinion. So I personally think it's great. Okay, so we are going to go on. We have more questions. This is from Laura. Welcome, Laura. Do all designated representatives on a representation agreement need to sign the agreement?
That is a question for which I'm not entirely certain. I would think that the answer would be yes, but that's the first time I've heard that question. I would have to clarify that for you. What I would recommend you do, Laura, to make sure you're 100% certain, email standardforms@orea.com. And that is our team of standard form legal experts who will answer that question for you. That's standardforms@orea.com. I think the answer is yes. And I don't see any harm in making sure every signature is achieved on that listing agreement, but double check with standardforms@orea.com.
Yeah, because I would think, Ray, that like Laura and Ray, I would think that's not even just a TRESA question. That's also if you're in a situation where you need to, back up or take action to do with your BRA. And I do know there's some precedent that if you have a buyer, like you have a husband and wife, you have one sign, not the other, or you have an investor group and you have one sign and not the other, you're going to have, in the precedent I've seen, major issues trying to back up that BRA. So, I think it's good practice, for sure, just because we support a lot of BRAs and, you want them to be straightforward and transparent and all that good stuff. I think it's always just good practice, right? Okay. Thank you for that question. And okay, and here is the compliment, which we're also going to read, Ray. So Mustak came back again, Century 21 Leading Edge. I've attended at least 4 different sessions of TRESA. This has been the most simple and clear-cut way of explaining the most confusing change in our industry. Thank you, Ray and Kathleen, for this valuable session. And we give full credit to Ray to coming and explaining it so great. So thank you, Ray.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that because this was very aggressive. This presentation is generally 90 minutes, so I'm glad you got something out of it. I was worried that I was going too fast. And if you guys want the full version of it, you can find it at orea.com/TRESA. There's a 90-minute recording of the November 30th session that I did. So it's there waiting for you if you want to do this over again or have a little bit of a deeper dive into some of these topics. I only touched on 4 of the 8 changes for you today. I didn't talk about RECO's discipline committee. Why? Because none of you are ever going to find yourself there. But I wanted to really focus in on those things that really impact your day-to-day business. And we touched on them at a very high level. Those 4 things we talked about are 4 things we have to do.
Okay. And Ray, maybe I'll message you and just make sure, and I'll get the link for that 90-minute and the booklet, and we can send it out with the recording. So that's no problem.
That's great.
Okay, great. And Quinn Tran, good to see you, Quinn. I'm glad you are here. I haven't seen you in a little bit. Is the RECO information guide applicable to rentals, as in tenants and landlords?
It is. TRESA applies to every single type of real estate trade: commercial, rentals, resale, new homes, condominiums. It's all encompassing. So we've got to use that info guide in every single type of trade in real estate. Great question.
Thank you. And Jessica has asked, do you need to disclose designated representation to all offers, even if it is not a multiple representation situation?
No. So what I think is going to be the challenge is brokerages are expected to pick a lane. That is, brokerages are expected to be a brokerage representation office, like was your only option within REBA, or make a statement that we are now a designated representation brokerage. However, having said that, there's nothing in legislation that says you have to pick one or the other. I mean, realistically, brokerages could practice both brokerage rep and designated rep. I think that's confusing to the realtors in the brokerage. I think it's going to be confusing to consumers. I think brokerages really do need to pick a lane. And if brokerages don't pick a lane, I think they're going to have to create some kind of system, some kind of trigger within the brokerage that would identify which lane they're driving in. I think MLS systems might have to try to do the same. Like if I'm a listing agent and you bring me an offer on one of my listings, I don't know if you are acting as a brokerage rep or a designated rep. And then I might receive an offer from one of your colleagues from the same brokerage. And if you guys are practicing brokerage rep, not designated rep, you guys on the buying end are now in multiple rep. And I need to let you guys know that. But if you guys were practicing designated rep, there wouldn't be multiple rep on your side. Therefore, I can't say anything. So we've got some things to figure out. I don't think the MLS systems yet have got that far, but they need to get on it.
Okay, so when we're submitting an offer, the listing agent would know with the new forms because you're indicating it there. But just to confirm, Ray, so if I'm within a brokerage, right, let's say I'm selling, I have my team, I'm the listing agent, and I know maybe, hey, I don't want to be direct with the buyer and seller. I might have a team member, support on the buyer side or another agent, whatever. Am I able currently as an individual salesperson to choose designated or brokerage representation on a case per case basis with my BRA, or is that something my brokerage is deciding?
You still are an employee of the brokerage. Therefore, that decision is frankly that of the brokerage. Like in my brokerage, for example, I set the policy, I set the tone, I made the decision. We are a brokerage representation office moving forward.
Got it. Okay.
That was the opportunity for the realtors in my office to say, no, we disagree for this reason. And I guess I could have said, make your decision on a transaction by transaction basis, but I think that's chaotic, right? You need to pick a lane from my perspective, and that's what I did. But realistically, you could flip flop from listing to listing, from BRA to BRA. I think it's problematic, but to be honest, if you want to fly by the seat of your pants, the law would allow you to do so. But it is
If
the
your broker
brokerage. Like
allows.
if
Okay.
yeah, like my policy is strictly, we are designated rep, full stop.
Okay. And I know we're a couple minutes over time. Are you okay, Ray? We still have a couple more questions,
Yeah,
but I
let's
want to
get through
respect
a
your
couple
schedule.
more.
Okay. Okay. Cameron has asked, why is there a whole dedicated page on information guide on how to make a complaint? I know of no professional that would ask a new client how to make a complaint at their first intro. I feel this creates mistrust and promotes complaints.
Yeah, so I mean, really, it was the government who is requiring the use of the information guide in consultation with RECO. Like, not only did the government reach out to its major stakeholders, OREA being the largest stakeholder on the real estate front, but every single real estate board, every single registrant in the province was asked to engage with the government on these consultations that delivered TRESA. Maybe some of you on this call today did in fact participate in that consultation. I mention all of this because the Real Estate Council of Ontario, another major stakeholder on the real estate file for legislation, probably the RECO, the Real Estate Council of Ontario, advocated for this information to be provided in there. It's all about transparency in real estate. It's about increased clarity in real estate transactions. I will tell you, because I work for OREA, is that when we saw an initial draft of the information guide, initially it said, here's how you file a complaint with RECO. And as a practicing broker of record, as a realtor in the trenches with each and every one of you every day, I said, no, that's not right. As a broker of record, I want consumers to know that if they have a concern in a real estate transaction, that they can in fact reach out to me and express their concern to me. As a broker of record, I want to be able to address that concern. And the government agreed. They said, you know what, that's reasonable. I think there's a lot of consumers out there in real estate transactions who think that when they're interacting with you, that's their only source of contact. They need to know that there's management in the brokerage that they can reach out to rather. So it was all to answer the question quite directly. I know I went off on a tangent there, but really it's for increased transparency and increased clarity in real estate transactions. And guess what? None of you guys have to worry about complaints to RECO because you're not going to do anything wrong that would trigger a complaint.
It's a good manifestation. I like it. Corrine Marks. Hello, Corrine. If you have a buyer SRP contact you who wants to view your client's listing, but then asks you for a CMA, sold data, etc., but because those are your skills and they are not a client, you cannot provide that. But if you ask those 3 questions that make implied agency, does that make them your client? Not sure if I explained it properly. I'm trying to understand. Are you okay?
Yeah, I get the question.
You have it, Ray?
You nailed it. The question, the implied answer in the question was exactly right. Absolutely. If that person responds favorably to your offer of services, yes, send me those listings, Ray. Yes, send me those sold listings, Ray. Yes, Ray, I need you to write my contract. You have created implied agency. You can now show them those other brokerages listings.
Even without them signing the actual representation agreement?
Absolutely.
Just with
Yep.
Interesting.
And we do that today. Like when I do this presentation in person, sometimes I've had hundreds of people in the classroom. It's so I can engage with that many people because we're eye to eye. I see everybody in the audience. And I say to the group, how many of you today build relationships by taking buyers out and showing them properties before you ask them to marry you by signing that BRA? And 90% of the hands go up in the room. That doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong. Implied agency is addressed. It's alive and well within TRESA. Yes, it's the best. It's a best practice. It's the gold standard. It's textbook scenario to get that BRA signed before you put somebody in your car and let them smell the leather in your car. But I know we instead prefer to build relationships. That's okay to do.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting because I think, you know, like over the years, I'll even say myself when I was actively selling, I mean, many times sat down and done a buyer consultation with somebody who was working implied agency with another realtor who then signed and worked with me. Because I mean, our data, like for people looking at how do we imply this, you know, our data, if you have the skills to meet with somebody that you're like that lawyer, doctor, accountant, they choose to work with you, 4 times less leads to reach our goals. So there's other sides of this that I think representation is just so powerful for the industry. It's such a great thing. So I hear what you're saying, Ray. I'm a big advocate for like professional standards. And I think TRESA gives us such a call to action to really raise our ability, you know, to communicate around this, which I know what's part of it. So I'm just doing the other side, right?
Yeah,
The
and I'm on the
strategy
same
side
page
of
with
this.
you. Remember,
Yeah.
guys, when I said if you're able to get a BRA signed before you take a buyer out and show them properties, don't change a thing. Remember when I said that? That's why I agree entirely with what Kathleen just said. That's why I said don't change a thing. And I'm speaking to a very different audience today. You guys are here because you're clients of Kathleen's. You are receiving professional coaching. You are the cream of the crop by virtue of the fact that you're investing in your profession. So I respect the fact that I'm probably speaking to a very talented group of realtors who have those abilities to illustrate to prospective clients your true value. So keep doing that. Keep showing your value by the way Kathleen just said.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ray. I think we're on the same page, which is awesome. Chris Owens, and I think we'll take a couple more because I think they're still trickling in here. So when preparing a CMA and meeting with a prospective seller, am I to understand? I think we've answered the same one almost 3 times. So I think this is a big question. Am I to understand this is not a service? So a RECO guide acknowledgement, oh, it is different, is not required.
You know, this is the problem with legislation. The legislation doesn't say you must do this at this specific time. Like, and in fairness to legislation, it's impossible to contemplate every type of interaction, every activity. The legislation says this of the info guide: before you provide any services, before you provide any help to an SRP. That's what the legislation says. You have to, in your own mind, determine when that time is right. I think, as Kathleen just said about getting that BRA signed at a consultation, is how you, as a talented group of professionals, are going to conduct yourselves in handing out this info guide. You're going to give it at the earliest practical opportunity. That doesn't mean you're going to sit down and read it word for word. Remember, half of your obligation is to provide them with a copy. There's the right time to do that. You guys will know when that right time is. But the legislation doesn't pinpoint a specific event. It says before services or before help.
Perfect. And
My advice: get it out of the way at the earliest practical opportunity, when it's comfortable to do so, when the opportunity presents itself. You know, here it is. Here's some information about real estate that you may find beneficial. We don't have to overcomplicate it. I think when I see people asking me lots of questions in my business, we're thinking too hard about it. We're overcomplicating it. Here's some information about real estate that you may find beneficial. You know, after we look at a couple of properties, I'm going to explain it to you in a little bit greater detail. Let's not overcomplicate it.
yeah, I'm seeing some of the questions, and Ray, it seems like definitely there's always been a difficulty in that blurred line of marketing to service, right? And the way that we jump into that. And I'm seeing a lot of questions about that. And I know at some point we will have to cut the questions. And I will say, Ray, I know Ray talked about potentially in the future having a deeper dive webinar with specific questions. And we'd love to have you back, Ray, and we'll book a bit more time for questions as well. So there's a couple of quick ones. So I want to hit on these. Laura's asking, saying, is the RECO guide to be used with commercial as well? Because it only seems to reference residential.
Yeah, it is actually. The RECO guide that you see published on their website is intended to be provided to commercial clients as well. I did send an email to RECO and said, look, guys, I'm hearing a lot of concern out there from commercial practitioners that even the photos that you use in the info guide are residential based only. You may wish to consider creating a guide strictly for commercial practitioners. I red flagged it as a concern that I'm hearing out there in the marketplace. So what they'll do with that info, Laura, I don't know, but I hear you loud and clear.
Okay, and Jessica is thanking us for this session. Thank you for being here, Jessica. We appreciate that. Another specific, I think we're having a mix here of, you know, when there's a question, there's questions. Okay, I'm going to read it because I'm trying to see if I can merge a few of them to get more of your questions answered. So the next question from Anonymous, including the full info guide in a new buyer seller package used during a first meeting seems overwhelming with the other info already covered during those meetings. Previously, we included the OREAs working with a realtor information brochure in our packages, but it's now been discontinued with the old forms. Is there something similar coming from OREA that can be used as a light introduction before providing them with the full guide?
The answer to that is an easy no. And the reason for that is the legislation says there's only one guide that can be used, one and only guide, and there can only be one author of that guide. That is the Real Estate Council of Ontario. Even if OREA had an appetite to create a condensed version, they're restricted from doing so because the law says they can't.
Okay, so that part is done. So having a flow that works with the paperwork in your full consultation is going to be very, very important for all of us. And Corrine, you said, what about your client's listing? I'm just going back to your original question, Corrine, to see if you have a buyer, self-represented party contact you, wants to view your client's listing, which I'm assuming that you're saying is your listing, but then you give them a CMA, sold data, you're using those skills, but they're not a client. So I don't know.
They are a client. Once you give them those services, you have crossed that fine line in the sand and you have made that consumer a client by the things you said and the things you did. We've got to be fully aware that our actions, those things we do and the things we say, can create those accidental or unintentional client relationships. We don't do it because we're bad people. We, in fact, do it because we're helpful individuals. Realtors are helpful by nature. We want to try to help people move. That is buy and sell real estate, right? And we just are so good-hearted in so many cases, we accidentally create client relationships when maybe that wasn't our intention. I think TRESA puts a spotlight on the fact that we need to know where that line in the sand is, and we need to know when we're stepping over it.
Yeah, it's another indicator when some people say, well, representation is just for agents. I'm like, well, when I read it, you know, we do all the work and we're obligated to act in our rules and regulation, and the client is not obligated to buy. And now what I'm hearing even more, Ray, which I think is so important, is why I'm repeating it, is that, hey, we could by accident or intentionally be helping people and put implied agency, but that doesn't stop them later on when we do paperwork from saying, well, I'm going to choose to be self-represented. So we can provide, but it doesn't mean that we're actually going to be compensated unless we're doing the right steps and the right paperwork, which I think, you know, is important, right? To illustrate.
Well, it is, you know, none of us would ever start marketing a seller's property, investing in professional photography, professional staging, dishing out thousands of dollars in marketing services without a commitment from the seller. That is a listing agreement. But we do it all the time with buyers. We go out and work with buyers with no written agreement in place, and we're at risk of not getting paid for our services if they end up buying with somebody else. Where do we need to improve in our business from my perception? And now I'm really off on a tangent, I know, is we've got to get better at our buyer consultation meetings. We've got to improve there. None of us would ever do that on the listing side.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I know our remaining questions, I'm going to kind of loop them to do with marketing here, but I really, right, you know, I can't say how much I believe. Like when I was selling real estate, I was a single mother, and I mean, track data, 98%. If somebody's meeting with me, they're going to 98% were choosing to sign a BRA, 2% were not, right? That's their choice. And I think it's because I believed in it so much. Like when I went to coaching full time, I had 86 active BRAs. Like this is one of the most important parts of our businesses. So when people say, how do you help teams when the markets are shifting? It's like, because we have systems that help us and help our clients, which is really important. So I want to group these last questions, right? Because we have you here and I'm hearing marketing. So I'm hearing people say, listen, we send out a newsletter or we offer searches on our websites. Like, do we need to stop doing this? Do we need to send paperwork? What do we do about our marketing initiatives?
Your marketing, guys, is information. It's information only. When are you treading into client territory? It's when you're giving opinions or advice. Drip campaigns, postcards in the mail, door knocking, general questions about how's the market. Continue to do that. None of those activities are yet in respect of a trade. TRESA refers to all of these regulations being in respect of a trade. Somebody asks you at a cocktail party, how's the market? Don't freak out. Let them know how the market is. That's not in respect of a trade when you're giving them general real estate information. And I just want to make sure that you guys are going to have questions tonight, tomorrow, next week, or next year. Let me share with you how you can continue to get your questions answered. Remember off the top, I showed you OREA.com/TRESA. That's a dedicated website to all things TRESA. If you go there, you're going to see what we call TRESA in 2. We call it TRESA in 2 because none of our videos are longer than 2 minutes in length. They're down and dirty, they're raw and real, they're very direct. We talk about all of these changes that are within TRESA that you need to know. I encourage you to watch them. If there's any gray area, you might get further clarification. Angie and Marg use different examples and explain things differently than I do, which will help you increase your understanding. On that website, we have an FAQ section. As we receive questions from members around the province, we answer those questions on the OREA website. A lot of the questions you guys asked me today, we've answered on the OREA website. A lot of the questions you're going to come up with in the future are answered on the website. Check it out. But here's my favorite part. Reach out and the get in touch button. See on your screen that get in touch button. If you click on that on our website, you're going to be asked for your name, your email address, and you insert your question. I answer every single one of those questions on behalf of OREA. We're getting hundreds of questions a day, and I'm still turning those questions around with answers in less than 24 hours. So OREA truly has your back in making sure that you comply with these new regulations. Feel free to use that. OREA is here to help.
Thank you for that, Ray. And thank you for everyone for joining us. Some of you know that this is part of an overall webinar series that we did coming out of Kathleen Black's summit. Really want to lean in at this time where we've had obviously some economic shifts here in Ontario. We're having some industry shifts. And I can't say enough for those who are part of our coaching community, the shifts that are happening, they are a perfect opportunity for us to lean in, for us to hone our skills and truly elevate the professionalism in the industry in Ontario. I couldn't be more excited about the changes. I can't say how excited I am that we're so poised for growth within this specific community, because these are tools that we already use. This is just a call to get even better at them, which means we're more professionally supporting our potential clients, our active clients, and there's nothing but good that's going to come from that. We do have another webinar in this series happening on Thursday. So please join me. Gord Lemon and David Gorski will be here from REI Institute. So talking about how to support your clients with the language of investment, which is definitely a unique language outside of just the resale side of things. And then you will be getting an email for one extra we're adding on. I am coming on September 12th. And the whole purpose of that is to talk about what we are focusing on right now going into 2024 with our coaching clients, from the top teams in the country to solopreneurs and new agents. So what we're focusing on, why, how we're being strategic, and answer all your questions when it comes to coaching. But I'm also going to give you a lot of data, including our buyer system and how it links in with some of the things that Ray's been talking about today. today. So please join us for one of those webinars or both. And please, from where you are, because we're on webinar, join me in thanking Ray so much. Again, we appreciate your time, Ray. We'd love to have you back to dive deeper if you're open to it in the future. And we appreciate you being here with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. Make it a great day.
Thanks, everybody. See you all soon.